Completed in 1965 and situated along the banks of the Mississippi River, the Gateway Arch, also known as the St. Louis Arch, is one of America's most prominent monuments to its own countryside. Figuratively, one can stand on the opposite bank of the Mississippi, the other half of the United States, and stare straight through it past farmland to the Rockies. There is a reason it's considered, even in eastern Missouri, to be one of America's gateways to the West. But it also has come to symbolize something else in the college sports world. The midway point between two power conference schools whose rivalry has seemed to slip through the cracks. Today, we're talking about the history of the Arch Rivalry, also known as Braggin rights, between the Missouri Tigers and the Illinois Fighting Illini, a rivalry game that might just potentially be one of the most overlooked and forgotten games in the Power Five as a whole. Why doesn't this game have staying power? What's kept it from becoming one of the more prominent out-of-conference rivalries, especially now that it holds an interesting position between the two conferences jockeying for dominance? Why don't we care about this game? In this video, I'll examine this interesting game, not deserving of the name rivalry, and try to run through its history briefly, as well as try to determine why this game is still played and why it isn't that big of a game. The Arch Rivalry is, of course, named after the St. Louis Arch. St. Louis itself is situated just about halfway between Columbia, the home of the Tigers, and Champaign, the home of the Fighting Illini, making it the perfect place to play a neutral site game. But the Arch hadn't been built the first time these two teams played. As odd as it was for a neutral site to be selected for a game played this early, Missouri and Illinois first played each other in 1896. This 1896 game, played at the pastime grounds at De Hojamont in St. Louis, was a dismal display of football, even for the late 1890s standards. Mizzou entered the game at 1-1, with a loss to what would eventually become Iowa State, and a victory against Tarkio College, which doesn't exist anymore. Illinois was undefeated after 2 games, with victories against Lake Forest and Knox College. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch called it wretched, and then proceeded to write a very flowery metaphor for just how sad and embarrassed Mizzou must have been on their ride home. I mean, just look at this. Sports writers don't write like this anymore. What happened? Anyway, the writer goes on to describe what happened. Missouri couldn't manage to do much of anything right, and Illinois, while also playing very poorly, just managed to play slightly better than their southern counterparts. After some poor running, Illinois managed a great 60-yard gash, and in a handful of tries, managed to push the ball over to score once. 4-0 Illinois. Yeah, that's how long ago this game was. Another ill-timed Mizzou fumble led to another Illinois score. The game finished 10-0. Football as a sport would undergo many more changes from there. This would be apparent the next time they played in 1913. The Illini would once again take the victory, this time at home, 24-7, in a game that more closely resembled modern football than it did rugby, like the previous game. How so? Forward passes were thrown. But the next game would not be played between these two teams for another 36 years. The Tigers made their first trip to Champaign in 1949, this time notching their first victory in the matchup, 27-20. Another lengthy period without play was established before the two non-conference opponents decided to create some form of permanency to the rivalry in 1966. From here, games were played a bit more regularly, despite not every season. The Tigers began to take control, winning by a touchdown in 1966, then by 44 in 1968, which wasn't even the largest earth-shattering event to take Missouri and Illinois that year, before a return game to St. Louis in 1969, where Mizzou would finish their sweep with a final score of 37-6. Another brief period of absence would take over before the game would hit a 6-game series from 1975 to 1980. The 75 game saw the Tigers once again take the victory in Champaign, this time by 10 points. The following year in Columbia, the Fighting Illini were able to provide some sort of return fire, with a resounding 31-6 victory, which was followed the next season in Champaign by an odd 4-point victory. 1978 saw a return to the blowout as the Tigers put on a show for the home crowd, winning 45-3. A forgettable 1979 game was replaced by another blowout in 1980. 1980 also provided a new wrinkle into this game, this time on the basketball side of things. While the game had been played before due to proximity, and even had been played over the last 4 seasons, the nickname of Arch Rivalry hadn't been coined yet to describe the series. By no means an afterthought on the basketball court even up until 1980, A new nickname of Braggin rights hinted at the quickening pace the two schools began to take with each other into their sports, and the basketball version of the game would return to St. Louis as a neutral site game, played in what is now known as the Enterprise Center. Let me repeat, the basketball version of this rivalry was always hot. In 1980, it got even hotter. While Missouri held vigil as the more competitive team in football by 1980, Illinois was on its way to becoming one of the more competitive basketball programs in the country. While Harv Schmidt and Gene Bartow couldn't get the Illini going, Lou Henson's teams began to ascend rather quickly during the 80s, right around the same time Braggin rights began to take off. Henson would proceed to take the Illini on multiple tournament runs before Lonnie Kruger took over in '96. While Illinois does lead the Braggin rights all-time record 34-20, it's safe to say that the game will continue to hold the vigor it does for the next handful of seasons, especially considering it was renewed until 2029. But back to football. The game took a short break from 1980 to 1983, when Missouri once again took home the victory in front of home fans. But the return trip to Champaign the following season began a stretch of high-scoring matchups that became typical for the game moving forward. 1984 saw the Illini win their first game in 5 tries, 30-24. Winners would alternate the next few seasons during a 4-game stretch between 1991 and 1994, with the 94 game being a staggering 42-0 beatdown of the Tigers at the hands of the Illini. This would be the biggest victory for the Orange in their entire run during this rivalry. The game would take another short break until yet another home-and-home in 2002 and 2003, both of which Mizzou won. The final 4-game stretch, played between 2007 and 2010, was all won by Missouri. But the interesting thing about these last 6 games is that they were all played where it all started. Once again in St. Louis, Missouri, where the St. Louis Rams had been playing their games before they would later move back up to Los Angeles. In all, by 2011, this game had been played a total of 24 times. Of those 24 games, only a third took place in St. Louis, 17 were won by Mizzou, and only 7 were won by Illinois. On the outset, aside from the handful of games played in a neutral site, most would consider this game not a rivalry. And honestly, it probably isn't. Ask Tiger or Illini fans. It's a fun game, to be sure, but not really one that carries much animosity. But why is this? Why doesn't this game carry more of a fire than some other games, like, say, Illinois Northwestern or the Border War? Well, let's look at Illinois first. The most prominent reason for Illinois to not necessarily care too much about Missouri compared to teams like Purdue or Northwestern is because, well, at the end of the day, they don't have much history with Missouri. Illinois has never shared a conference with Mizzou, despite their close proximity and Mizzou's many pushes to join the Big Ten in the 80s and 90s. On top of that, their performance in these games hasn't really been too competitive over time, aside from a few blowouts. Missouri's a little easier to diagnose. Their main rival, Kansas, has much more of a historical connection with them and their fan base, having been former conference rivals in the Big 12 before the Tigers leaped to the SEC in 2010, which, ironically enough, is the last time they played Illinois on the football field. On top of that, Missouri's odd stance in the SEC provides them a whole host of in-conference opponents that carry more bad blood than it feels like Illinois ever could. So then, why is this game being brought back in 2026 if nobody cares about it? The answer to that is pretty simple. People do care. But it's a different kind of rivalry, one closer in temperature to that of Farmageddon in the Border War. More of a friendly exhibition than anything else. But, as you can probably tell, the biggest aspect to this game, and the reason I think it's still going to be played, is the centerpiece at the middle of the game, St. Louis, Missouri. Grads from Mizzou and Illinois naturally gravitate towards St. Louis as a strong metro area wedged in between the two states. With a strong media presence to boot, the game would naturally have a very positive impact from being played there. So the game itself is less a rivalry built on bad blood or historical precedents, and more so one created to celebrate the shared history of a city with the 2 colleges that come to make up a majority of its people's alma maters. But now another wrinkle has been added into the conversation, that of conference realignment and the constant push between 2 conferences, Illinois' Big Ten and Missouri's SEC, to become the top dog in the NCAA. This game becomes yet another battleground between those 2 conferences to dictate which is building the better football product. In an era where fans are more likely to cheer for their conference logo over cheering against their rivals in an unaffiliated game, when this game returns, it could gain more spice and vigor than it has in any of its previous iterations. But, once again, Time will have to tell for that. 2026 will mark the next time these two programs play, on campus as opposed to in St. Louis. And so I'll kick it out to you as viewers. Were you aware of the Arch Rivalry before this video? Mizzou and Illini fans, what are your personal thoughts on this game? Does it have the firepower to become a real rivalry game in the future, or is it just a fun game to be played every once in a while? What's the temperature on it for each fan base? Hey again, thanks for watching. Been sick for a while, so I'm just now getting back to making videos. Hope I didn't scare you. Stay healthy out there and online, and I'll see you next time.